Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Welcome to the Lake George Battlefield Moments podcast. This is John Denuzzo of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. The guest today is Chris Carola, an Alliance member who worked for 31 years as a reporter for the Associated Press in Albany, covering everything, breaking news, crime, politics, government, feature stories on New York State's history, which we're particularly interested in. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me, John.
So, Chris, what do you think is happening now or possibly in the near future that's of interest to the media, both in the region and on a national or international stage?
Well, right here in Lake George, the great work the Alliance has been doing to preserve the battlefield, because it's such a rich source of history, local history, because of what happened there in the 1750s. And it's like Lake George is kind of encapsulated, literally, our history is under, a few inches underground, as people around here know. If you build a new hotel or a new sewer line, sometimes you uncover things like remains of people who died back then. That's been going on since the 50s. Since especially when they built the Fort William Henry, they uncovered human remains of people who were killed during that era. And I wrote several stories about that. I was the first reporter to report that that the Fort William Henry's skeleton collection wasn't at the fort. It was at a university in the Southwest. And the good news is it looks like the fort is moving towards bringing those remains back for burial here in Lake George. And that's a very unique thing, that collection of remains from the French and Indian War. There just aren't a lot of them.
Interesting. And again, growing up, living around here, we're probably somewhat numb to the fact how unique this is. That you don't get that other places around the country or around the world for that matter. And yeah, the good news is that there's certainly recognition to recognize those kinds of circumstances, that we can pay homage to them 250 plus years later, and give them a suitable final resting place. So we're very interested in that story as well. So can you just kind of retrace the Fort William Henry story, and ultimately, I know it's got a happy ending forthcoming, but what made you curious about that, first of all?
Well, I had been coming up here, like I said, starting in the 90s. Every other year or so, I do stories on David Starbuck's archaeological digs here in Lake George and Fort Edward. And I found out that the collection that had been uncovered of human remains when they first built the fort in 1755, and then later others were uncovered, were supposed to be reinterred in the early 1990s. And they were going to have a ceremony for that reinterment of these soldiers' bones. But the anthropologists who were brought in to study these remains realized that they were running out of time. They needed more time because it was such a large collection, and they were learning so much by examining these remains of how people lived back then, and maybe what they ate and what injuries they suffered. So the fort gave them permission to take one of the anthropologists to take about a dozen skeletons with her to her next job. It wasn't until years later that I found out about the situation and reported, and that story got international interest because especially the British media, any stories I did on the Revolutionary War, the French and Indian War, the British press loves those stories. So my stories out of Lake George would be published and posted and printed in major British media outlets, bringing a lot of notice to Lake George about the history. And I always thought that was important because somebody like David Starbuck would say, after one of my stories came out on his digs, that people were coming out of the woodwork literally to visit these sites and learn more because they'd seen this AP story on an archaeological dig. And that would give David an opportunity to talk to people about how important that history is. And he was very good at that. He was very good at explaining why this history is important and how unique Lake George's connection is to that whole Last of the Mohicans era that Fenimore Cooper based his book on events that happened right here. And a lot of people probably haven't read the book, but a lot of them have seen that movie, that Daniel Day-Lewis movie, Last of the Mohicans. And I tell people, those events actually did happen. I mean, they're fictionalized in the movie, but they're based on actual events and attacks and people that were here.
That's fascinating because we live in our little cocoons, and even, those who've traveled a bit, you don't really recognize just how unique it is, what we have here. We get inquiries increasingly from Quebec, Montreal, Quebec City, other places, particularly part of the French side of the French and Indian War. Now, you mentioned Britain, and it certainly makes sense they would be. Can you just distinguish for the people who listen, certainly the reinterment that's going to happen at the Lake George Battlefield Park next year will be of 44 presumed casualties of smallpox. I mean, that's what the evidence seems to indicate. The French Indian War remains are probably of a different cause of death, correct?
They from what I recall, they were able to find out that some of those remains of people were actually killed during the siege in 1757. Others were uncovered in what would have been the fort's military graveyard. And they were able to determine in some of those skeletons, the skeletons showed wounds, either head wounds or wounds to limbs. But also, when you have something like smallpox, that leaves evidence in your bones. And these anthropologists were able to determine that, yeah, some of these guys might have died from smallpox. And you mentioned the Revolutionary War remains that were found. I wrote about that before I left the Associated Press, and that was another story that went out on AP's national and international news wires, particularly up in Canada. You mentioned Quebec. They're very interested in that French and Indian War history down here because of, Montcalm was here. And a lot of his officers were from Quebec, from Montreal. And the Canadians also love that history. So that reinterment of the Rev War remains, that's an international news event. And then with the French and Indian War remains to follow, again, that's going to be another international news event. It's going to bring a lot of notice to Lake George. And I think people are really going to be behind this project to reinter these remains of basically soldiers who were the beginning of our army, of our modern army today. These are the guys that started it all.
Expanding the bubble here a little bit, tell us a little bit about some of the interesting people you've been in contact with through your career, not necessarily celebrities, but the people who kind of had the most interesting stories and what you learned from them.
Some of the people I really liked and enjoyed interviewing and meeting were veterans, World War II veterans. I interviewed a lot of World War II veterans. But on the subject of French and Indian War, when I started getting into it, I started meeting historians and authors and local historians, reenactors. I learned a lot from the reenacting community about the French and Indian War, because I would ask them, what books do you read? What articles? What TV shows? What journals? And I learned so much from them. And then from doing these type of stories on the French and Indian War, I'd reach out to authors and historians and interview them on the phone or meet them at places like Lake George or Ticonderoga. Pulitzer Prize winners like Fred Anderson, wrote Crucible of War, an excellent book on the French and Indian War. Stephen Brumwell, a British author, expert on 18th century British military history here in North America. Russ Bellico, who's a member of the Alliance. And I just learned so much from these folks, and they were just so forthcoming with their info and their help and their books. And I really enjoyed talking to those folks.
What more do you think that we should be doing, we collectively, the history community that covers, say, from Saratoga Battlefield up north to Ticonderoga and Crown Point? Are there more things we can do to take advantage of the 250th anniversary of the Revolution and other major events that will have people coming to the region?
Yeah, I do keep in touch with some folks involved with that and on social media, and I'm glad to see that, like you mentioned, the 250th anniversary planning, that's underway in places like Schuylerville, Saratoga County. As you know, up here, Revolutionary War contact links and such. I'm happy to see that that's started, because you have to start these things now, and the planning is now for events. Other than, just trying to, in some way, kind of help each other out, saying, hey, we've got this event. Can you help promote our event? That groups can do that now. It's a lot easier than it used to be. But it's gratifying to see people realize this can bring a lot of people to our area, these commemorations, and really help out our tourism, our cultural tourism industry, which is a very important part of the overall tourism industry in New York State.
Well, fabulous. And, one of the great things about the Alliance, we have more than 270 members now, and we have, I think, a nice diversity of talent and backgrounds. Chris, I think, really sensitizes us to what plays in terms of not only in the immediate capital region, Adirondacks, but also, as you just mentioned, globally around the U.S., other parts of the world where there is interest. We see more and more international tourists come to our visitor center. Certainly Quebec, Ontario, Western Canada as well, but more and more from Germany, England, France, Italy. And we hadn't seen that in the first year or the first year or two of the visitor center. So the word is getting out. People like Chris Carola have been carrying the banner for a long time. Thank you for your many contributions, Chris. I know you're a very active member, and we appreciate that.
Well, I enjoy it. I enjoy coming up here, and I enjoy meeting people, and I enjoy telling this history and at every opportunity, because it's our history. It's our American history, and it's endlessly fascinating, and it's fun.
Amen. Okay. Thank you, Chris Carola. Lake George Battlefield Moments. Visit our website, lakegeorgebattlefield.org, and come to our programs.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in every Saturday morning for Lake George Battlefield Moments.